Hello, welcome. Good afternoon to our CrowdTuesday on ECSP today. Thank you for everyone who's joining right now in the entities here and in the panel, and thank you for everyone who's watching this now or later on YouTube. We're EUROCROWD, the European Crowdfunding Network, representing platforms across Europe on policy matters, but also on other issues. And we are here today to discuss the work around the European Crowdfunding Service Provider regulation that has been passed last year in the European Parliament after negotiations between Council, Parliament and Commission, and which is currently being reviewed by the European Security and Markets Authorities, and which has a public consultation open until Friday, and which will then further detail some aspects of the ECSPR regulation before member states can fully implement this and also enact the law in the right way. And so that by November this year, in the first few member states, we will have this law in force, and the latest by November 22 in every EU member state. And that, of course, brings us to the big question: is this new law a threat or an opportunity for the market? And we would like to discuss this today with our members that are joining me in a minute, as well as with the audience here. If I could ask our panelist, Christin Friedrich, CEO of Innovestment and chair of EUROCROWD, Lynn, co-founder and chairman of Seedrs, and Lisa Hees, legal counsel of Oneplanetcrowd, to join the call. Unfortunately, our friend Jens Engelmann Pilger could not join today. He's been of great help in the last few years when he was working with Funding Circle. He no longer is, and he couldn't get the time off today. So nonetheless, I'm very happy to have my other three panelists here on the call, which are going to shed some light on what ECSPR might mean. Christine, thank you very much. You've been chairwoman now with the EUROCROWD for quite some time. I've been quite active in driving issues in a positive way for the market. Can you maybe just give a little statement what ECSPR might mean for us?
Thanks, Oliver, for the introduction, and yeah, welcome everybody to our call today. That will be exciting to dive deeper into what ECSP actually means, and we could learn a lot in the last couple of weeks and months to understand the impact it will have and where maybe there are also still some issues to solve. First of all, I would like to acknowledge everybody from the platforms who have been around the last years, the last decade, to drive this industry forward, also in ECN, and also staff from ECN, Oliver, Francesca, Connie, and the others who have been really crucial in making this possible, because what we for sure can see is that ECSP wouldn't have been possible if from the early time of the industry, we wouldn't have been deeply in communication with the different European institutions and convinced and showed them the potential of crowdfunding for all the goals which are so important, like access to finance for SMEs and also investment opportunities. So crowdfunding is crucial for the modern upcoming economy of entrepreneurs, let's say, and to support Europe becoming and staying innovative. And in a way, what also was mirrored from the institutions was that ECSP is in a way one of the first bottom-up legislation which has happened on that level over so many years, and I really believe that there's a huge potential. Even maybe there are some things to figure out in the next couple of years by implementing the ECSP, that it will be a great gateway for further growth of our industry, further professionalism and understanding. And what I'm really, what I observed in the last months when it comes to national level discussions, that we still are a way to go to also make all the member states aware of the potential. And I hope that this conversation today can help us to shine a light on it. And I think, there's a lot still to progress, and it doesn't matter what will come up. I think we have always a chance to iterate and improve. the process. So even now what's coming out of the ECSP implementation, so it's never too late to be active and to get involved. And I can just invite everybody of you to join ECN and join the discussion. We will also have more this kind of calls in the future, also with associations and other interested parties, so that we can stay in the loop, as ECSP is not maybe easy to digest. That's what we are trying today, to make it more digestible and dive deeper. So you're welcome to any questions in the Q&A. You can put at Zoom down there. And we will also happy to have you on board here in the discussion further going. And it's super crucial that people who are actually practitioners are explaining why crowdfunding is so important and what actually platforms do. Because what I noticed, maybe one of the last points, is that sometimes they forget that it's not only investors who are our customers, but also companies. And we as an intermediary, our interest is to make it work and secure for all parties. And therefore, yeah, it's good to see it in a more holistic way. And yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm very excited and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Christine. Good. What we want to start with is a bit the background of this law, which some of you might know, some others might be less aware of. We, as EUROCROWD, we started discussing with some people in the commission back in 2012, and there was an interest in crowdfunding already at that time. And the commission actually, after internal discussions, created an internal workforce or work group on crowdfunding and launched a very big conference. Some people may remember this, in Brussels in 2013, back then under still Michel Barnier, in order to assess the market. And there was some further work done, but by 2014, the department in charge of crowdfunding or regulating crowdfunding concluded that at that moment, the financial services industry where crowdfunding was acting in was not really significant, was quite small. We didn't have big players. The big platforms that we may have come to know by now were not really that active. And so they decided not to enact on a European level any kind of law or directives, but they recommended to member states to not regulate the market and let the markets grow. As many of us know, that didn't happen. Many member states thought this was a good time to create national regulation, and therefore have also created fragmentation. And the Commission continued to observe the market, and people that have been to our events have met many of the relevant people in the Commission that worked on these files. And they came to the conclusion that by 2017, the market had changed, and that you could see champions evolve in certain areas, lending, equity, that some markets developed way better than others, and that there was some significance behind crowdfunding. And the realization was also there. We had a lot of exchange at that time, that one of the key aspects that was holding back truly scalable market was cross-border transactions. These were not possible under given law. So the Commission started to draft a proposal for what has now become a law, European Crowdfunding Service Provider Regulation, and published this in early 2018. And so around that time, Jeff joined, I think, for about 2.5 years, as well as Jens, who couldn't be here today, and Pascal Ouvra from formerly with them October, and Jens Engelmann-Pilger from Funding Circle at the time. I don't know, endless discussions with the European Commission, the European Parliament, and Council members. And so from the proposal that the Commission published in 2018 as a 29th regime, so separate regulation sitting next to national regulations and markets, enabling specifically cross-border transactions to grow champions. The discussion, of course, has led to what we now have, minimal harmonization, which is quite tightly knit, but it's still a harmonization where member states still can, left, right, and center make some adjustments in order to fit their needs and purposes. So, Jeff, maybe from your point, who's sat through this and spent, I don't know, hundreds of hours on your own money to help every other crowdfunding platform here in this call or not in this call. So they are all indebted to you for forever. What is the takeaway? What have you learned, and what can we kind of share with the audience there?
Absolutely. Thanks, Oliver. I suppose if everyone feels they owe me a debt, I guess I could send out invoices, but we'll see. No, it was a pleasure. I mean, as Oliver said, it was, this was a long time coming. I for one, had by early mid 2017 essentially given up on the notion that the commission would do anything. I thought we wouldn't live, or if they did, that we wouldn't live to see it. And I am a huge believer in the cross-border potential here. Yes, crowdfunding has a lot to do with community, but I also think that we have a wonderful ecosystem in Europe, certainly on the equity side, debt side too, where there's an opportunity to fund interesting businesses all across Europe. And I was keen to see it happen. So I've sort of given up, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, a proposal comes forward, and it was really very interesting and exciting to be part of it. And what Jens and Pascal and I really tried to do, along with Oliver and a number of others, was just try to help the various people who had a hand in drafting legislation understand how our platforms worked, what would and would not work in a regulatory environment, in a regulatory regime. And in some cases, we were, I think, very successful from the start. I mean, the Commission, for example, initially proposed a €1 million cap on the application of the regulation, across Europe. And, we all sort of threw our arms up and said, that's going to be far too limiting. Nobody will make use of it. And they said, well, let us see data. We think most crowdfunding occurs below €1 million. And we said, well, part of the reason that you think that is because a lot of local national regulations are still at $1 million. But here, let us show you places like the UK, which at the time was still technically a member, but in other countries which had a higher prospectus threshold. Look at the trend line. Look at how many more deals are getting done at the greater than €1 million level, and pretty quickly there was sort of consensus to move it. We'd hoped to get to 8 million. Ultimately, it was compromised at 5 for now. But that's a heck of a lot better than 1. So in some regards, I think it was a very successful process. Other places, I think we contributed well to the technical aspects of it. There was one issue around, there was an initial plan to say that no employees, managers, or 20% shareholders of crowdfunding platform could invest in anything on their platform. And, we just said, look, I mean, that's illogical. I mean, actually, as long as you require these people, insiders, to be investing on the same terms as everyone else, it aligns interests and it helps them understand how their own platform works rather than making them outsiders to it. And we, that point was ultimately persuasive. So there were a number of areas where we were successful, a number of other areas where we were less successful. And, making law at European level is about getting the consensus of, now I suppose 27 different member states from a wide variety of different areas. But I think there were maybe 2 or 3 kind of key decision points that really will shape the future here, and in addition to some of the specifics. One, as Oliver says, is around this 29th regime point. And I think the Commission's initial idea, the 29th regime was going to be an opt-in regime regulated by ESMA. And so the idea was that you had to have a choice as a platform. You could either stay or get regulated under your national regime and continue to do things as you were, or you could elect to apply for authorization by ESMA and operate Europe-wide. And we were supportive of that. Personally, my view, I mean, here at Seedrs, we've been, very sort of clear about our European ambitions and have been active, in various ways across much of Europe for a while. We think that opportunity is great, but we also, perfectly see and work together with many platforms that do want to stay at a national level. And I think the two could have coexisted very nicely. The problem was the Commission forgot to ask ESMA whether they wanted to do this. And there were some opponents in the European Parliament who really didn't like the idea of further federalization. Ironically, the opponents were led by a British Brexiteer MEP who was very good on a lot of stuff, but he was one of the most sort of anti-federalization advocates, and he had on his side ESMA that said, yeah, we don't want to do this. We don't have the reason. We're not, we're a technical standards and policy making body. We're not a supervisory authority. And so That dropped out, which I think then resulted in what we have today, which is a harmonization system where there will be no separate national and European regulation. I think it's an interesting move. I mean, I'll say very bluntly, I think that for platforms like ours that are keen to take advantage of the full European opportunity, we're sort of ambivalent. I don't think it makes much of a difference to us one way or the other. But I do think that if you want it to be a small, local, regional, national platform, it may prove to be a good bit harder, particularly depending on what member state you're in. If you're in an unfriendly member state, I think that's going to be tough. So there was a decision that was taken. I think it will shape the future of the market, and was in some ways slightly unfortunate for smaller platforms, but it sort of is what it is. And then I think the next set of decisions came around the level of harmonization, and where I think we were very fortunate was that the Commission held the line on the idea that this would be a regulation rather than a directive. And this gets into technical EU lawmaking, but regulations are directly applicable. They sometimes carve out specific things that member states can choose, but in the absence of an express carve out, the regulation applies without the member state doing it. Directives have to be implemented by national parliaments. And national parliaments are really good at sort of taking the broad outline of directive and then implementing it in their own way. And frankly, had MiFID originally been a regulation rather than a directive, we might not have needed separate crowdfunding regulation at all, because most, at least not on the loan side, but on the security side, most of what investment-based crowdfunding is theoretically covered by MiFID. It's just every member state implemented it in such different ways and with so many inconsistencies that MiFID was never really realistic for most platforms to operate cross-border. And we made the point very strongly that you're going to get if you make the crowdfunding regulation a directive, you're going to get the exact same situation, that there's no point. So they didn't. Everyone agreed on it being a regulation. It is directly applicable. There was a lot of debate around this sort of minimum versus maximum harmonization. And I think I think there's still not a huge amount of understanding or consistency of terminology in terms of what some of that means. I would call it, I wouldn't call what we wound up with minimum harmonization. I'd call it sort of medium harmonization. Maximum would have been no choices, no opt-outs, nothing at member state level. And we didn't get that. There are a number of things. Marketing rules will still be decided at member state level. Certain options around the keeping the threshold temporarily below 5 million euros. A few other things. But in a lot of regards, actually, the ECSP is quite prescriptive, doesn't allow member states a huge amount of room to move. And I think this is where probably the most important point comes, is that except for the marketing rules, there's virtually nothing in there that allows member states to gold plate or otherwise change regulation in their capacity as host states. So when you have harmonized regulation, you like this, you always have a concept of a home state, which is where the platform is actually regulated, and then all the other places where it does business, where it offers securities or where it offers capital raising services, are the host states. And while there is a good bit of variability at home state level, so different member states are looking to regulate their platforms differently, and I think you are going to see a lot of variability there. There are only a handful of areas where a given host state can say, no, you can't do X in our country. So, an Estonian platform, let's just say, will have to work with whatever Estonia's rules are that may be special to Estonia. But then when it wants to offer investment opportunities in Lithuania, there's not a whole lot that the Lithuanian government will be able to do. I think that's key. I think that actually is going to be one of the most important features of this regulation in terms of ensuring that a cross-border market does emerge. Lots of other interesting little stuff in there, but I think those are sort of the broad points, and happy to kind of go into detail. What I would say is that it was a fascinating process. They say making laws is like making sausages. You never really quite want to see what goes into them. There was some truth to that. It was a heck of a back and forth process, through three different bodies, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council, and we met with loads and loads of people. But I do think that the one thing I'd say in summary is that with a few exceptions, a few member states that have a very different view. For the most part, I think there is really quite broad support across Europe for what this is trying to achieve and for the role that crowdfunding can play in the startup, entrepreneurial, and investment landscapes. And I think one thing that's interesting is if you look at it at a member state level, you begin to see some divisions. But in the European Parliament, which is organized by party group rather than by member state, all four major parties, the ECR, which is sort of the quite conservative party, the EPP, which is the sort of center right, the Liberals, and the Social and Democrat Party, all voted entirely in favor of this. The only parties that voted against it were at the extreme left and the extreme right. So there is, I think, a really good political consensus in Europe that this is going to be a good thing. Technical details to be worked out, but I'm a big optimist about the future. Hand over.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I think you already made some good points here that are actually important to reiterate. And we also have a question with that regard. When you said member states are not able to change that much, then the point here is that a platform is regulated in a given member state under these rules and will have to operate under these rules. And when it offers its services in another member state, then that member state authorities have no options to further make their life difficult other than with the marketing and communications aspects. I think this is one point. The other thing maybe is, so it's clear the regulation applies on the member state where the platform is located. I think that is key, not where the issuer is based or not where the investor is based. And I think also you pointed out the sentiment in Brussels was positive. I mean, overall positive, great willingness to discuss, very, very competent discussion partners at all times, plus minus. But I think it was really interesting to see that we have this kind of support. Now, when we move to, and this is where the questions go to from Carsten here, of course, is the aspect of where we are now is the law has been passed. We achieved what we can do. We have 5 million euros. We enabled lending platforms that offer a kind of bundling of loans to also fall under this regulation. We negotiated quite a few things that enable now a crowdfunding sector to grow. Now ESMA is writing the level 2 texts, which is specified within the law, where they have some room for maneuver, and they will provide guidelines to member states how to best implement ECSPR, how to detail these things. And this is, I think, where a lot of discussion is happening. ESMA has an open consultation that closes on Friday. So every platform can actually put in their opinion, and they should. We have our draft opinion on our website. If you visit our website at EUROCROWD.org and go to the webinar of today, you find a link to a Google document. That's not perfect. That is just the opinion that we came up with our members. But the more platforms, argue in the same way and can agree on the same things, then the better we can influence the policy process. But here now we see that the discussion becomes national. That Germany clearly, and this is where Carsten refers to in his question, says there is a freedom of interpretation at some level now within the member states. Anyone in the panel has an experience and maybe an answer of how this can be dealt with once we have ECSP as a law next year? 15, 10, 20 member states will have enacted it in a feasible way, and 7, 12 may try to limit the scope of ECSPR. So what can we do now, and how do you deal with this in your legislations that you are working? Lisa, Christine, you want to join the discussion? Yes.
Lisa, should I just start? I think generally what is really interesting in seeing the debates in the member states is that there's really a window of opportunity also for regulatory competition. So there are obviously member states who are trying to limit the potential like liability issue in Germany. We can dive deeper into it later. Or other things which are actually counterproductive for the goal of the ECSP. And there will be a movement of platforms, I assume, seeing it from a platform provider perspective, where you, of course, want to have the best circumstances in the regime for your offer, for the usability, for the customers, that there will be a move to maybe the one or the other regime in the member states, which is more friendly. And as far as I heard, there are countries who are usually like Iceland, for example, who are always just implementing European regulation in a very basic level. So they don't try to bring in things like when you have a very strong consumer protection lobby, like we have in Germany, to make it as difficult as possible for the players. So yeah, I think it's a very important time right now, and I don't know how other member states are from the timeline, but to use the opportunity to convince the policymakers and regulators in the specific member state you are in to actually use this window of opportunity to grow the market, the local market more, and maybe even attract other platforms from other countries. And yeah, I mean, that's a few thoughts around this.
How is that going in your home state?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, in Germany in particular.
Okay, I tried to be politically correct enough here. I think it was quite an interesting journey where we as a German industry learned a lot about how the policymakers are dealing with this kind of questions, and that there is obviously a lack of understanding about what crowdfunding actually really is, starting from the differences between the different crowdfunding instruments, from the different focus, from the diversity of the market. It's very hard to oversee for people who haven't been involved with it before. We have the tendency, which is also sometimes, I mean, related to political parties maybe, which are less entrepreneurial and more trying to protect everybody, right? So the mindset of what an investor is a retail investor is in Germany, I think, very misleading and actually pisses me off, because I don't see our investors as, you know, insecure, unempowered people who don't know what they're doing, but most of them actually really know what they're doing. And with this attitude of we have to protect the last potential person who might not know what they're doing, we are creating a lot of friction, and also have a narrative which has to be changed from my point of view. We have, as an industry in Germany, maybe also in other countries, making clearer what the industry is about, why the stakeholders who are active are professional, learned their lessons over the years. I mean, who have been around in the industry for 5 or 10 years, has understood how important it is to protect your customers, your investors, in order to survive in the future. So it's our ingrained need and goal to protect investors. So it would be really valuable, and it's maybe an idea to throw out also to everybody who has the chance to influence things, to have a task force in each country where people actually really dive deep and understand the market. Because what we saw is that the people who are actually writing these laws and who are involved don't know enough to understand the consequences of their actions. And it's very hard to change them if they have started to make it so restrictive like we have it at the moment. But the good news is, as far as I heard, that on the 28th, we still have the opportunity to bring the law, which already has been gone through the parliament on the 6th of May, to kick it from the Federal Council into the re-evaluation in the next legislation, which will start in the autumn this year in Germany. So we're still hopeful that we can change some things, as the most critical point is the simple negligence for even members of the platforms and issuers. So that's one of the biggest issues we have in Germany right now, which we're working on.
Thank you very much. Lisa, you are also quite involved on national implementation issues. How's that going? I mean, how is your local authorities responding to the industry, and how's the industry responding to the market, and what can we on a European level maybe learn from this, or where we can we provide some guidance?
Yeah, sure. So the Dutch regulator, the AFM, is quite open for discussion about this new regulation and how we should implement it in the Netherlands. So for instance, for the ESMA technical standards, we had a call with the AFM, so Oneplanetcrowd, for practical issues with the technical standards, and to get a view of the AFM and how they see it in practice, considering the Dutch practices and the current legislation. And they were very open to hear the issues that we raised. And with respect to some issues, they were also willing to discuss them with ESMA themselves. So for instance, in Netherlands, most of the crowdfunding platforms have a separate foundation, and this foundation holds its own bank account. If the crowdfunding platform goes bankrupt, this bank account is separate from the bankruptcy estate, so it's protected. And all payments of the investors and the project owners go through such bank account. Under the new regulation, such a foundation would need to have a PSP license, but that's not common in the Netherlands. None of these foundations has such license, and the AFM understands this issue, this practical issue, and was willing to raise it with ESMA and to see if there's a solution for the Dutch market. So in that way, they seem very proactive and willing to help, which is a good thing.
The issue is here that the legal text prescribes PSD2 as a payment service provision. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, Jeff, have you already looked at some of the things where you may come into discussions with regulators, and do you have any feedback?
Yeah, I mean, we've looked across a number of areas. I guess a couple of the things that are of interest to us is one around the rules on SPVs. Some of you who know the Seedrs model, we use a nominee structure here in the UK. Nominees aren't really known, particularly in most European markets, and the way the legislation is drafted, I think is ambiguous at best as to whether a nominee would work under the regulation, but there is a specific provision for SPVs. How that works, how that's going to interact with the rules on custody and a few other things are certainly one interesting question for us. A second area that we're certainly looking at is secondaries and bulletin boards. So again, this was an area of significant debate within, in the lawmaking process. And it's a really interesting one, because at one end you have lawmakers saying, we really like secondaries. We want to see from an investor protection perspective, the opportunity to get liquidity on your investments is a good thing. So we want to encourage it. But we don't want to cross over into MiFID, MTF territory here and let people create a what would otherwise be a regulated market. And so, what ultimately landed was, some compromise wording on what kind of bulletin boards could be used. And I think we're still trying to wrap our heads around, what does that really mean in practice? How much, can a platform do versus what it can't do. So those are certainly two areas we're looking at. Payments are an interesting one as well, probably a little less relevant for us, but we think payments should be, will be important. And a number of other sort of smaller areas, all very much in our sights. There's a lot that still isn't known about how some of this will work in detail.
I think also where some of the questions come from, of course, we are now presented with a legal text that was drafted through endless discussions and negotiations, often political, as you already mentioned earlier, Jeff, where kind of within the process, you have the political power of parties in the parliament or of member states. And this text is, of course, open for interpretation to some level. And that, I think, is right now also where we need to just kind of see a little bit. One of the questions that Carsten also had earlier on is to exactly this point: what is an admitted instrument, and how easy is it for a member state to exclude admitted instruments? Admitted instruments here would be, within the scope of the law, the kind of company structures that can be traded under this. So often, or in general, this is referring to limited liability structures. And we know that in some member states, there's of course a keen intention to restrict investments through crowdfunding into limited liability. So here we need to see how this plays out. We know that some arguments by member states might not be according to the interpretation of the meaning of the legal text as maybe the Commission sees it, but in the end, we don't know if there will be something being enacted. So we assume that as per the legal text, for example, the pure exemption from limited liability companies under ECSPR, because they need a notary to approve the sale of shares, is not sufficient to exclude this. That would mean that in member states like Germany or Austria, limited liability companies would fall under ECSPR. Member states might see this differently. So I think this is where the interesting part right now is in the discussion, and how it will play out over the next 2 years. There was a question by Patrick Visser, which one is the best market to launch a platform? Well, I guess it's like playing lotto. Maybe somebody else knows. Maybe Lisa will shout the Netherlands. We need to see until the national regulations are being implemented, and when in the ECSPR is kind of being rolled out. But for sure, there will be member states that will use the opportunity and make it easier in their home state to incorporate platforms. Estonia, Malta, Luxembourg might be some of them. I think Germany is potentially not one of them, but you never know. So we shall see.
Oliver?
Yes?
May I add something to the admitted instruments and just why it's so crucial and so important, but maybe it's not so understood, that under ECSP, the goal was to make existing crowdfunding regulations obsolete. So it means that when a financial instrument, which has been regulated under a certain crowdfunding law in a member state, is falling under ECSP, this would also mean that the so far used crowdfunding regime will be taken over by ECSP, let's say. And this is one of the discussions why also Carsten, I guess, mentioned it, is that in Germany, for example, we have used to use only like subordinated loans and certain instruments which have been falling under the German crowdfunding law. And people believe, and this is not written, and that's a problem, it's just orally said by BaFin as a German regulator and the Ministry of Finance, which is in the lead, that these instruments will not fall under ECSP. And this is one of the crucial points to make sure that this actually is true, because otherwise a lot of platforms, especially smaller platforms, will believe that they can still operate in their normal model, and then they wake up one day and realize, shit, it is not the case, and now I have to change my model. So do you have any recommendations here, or do you open questions to you three, how to what kind of feedback do we need? I mean, can ESMA there bring clarity in when they say what are the financial instruments, or is each member state has to figure it out and then put it into ESMA or to the European institutions, and then they say yes, works or not? I mean, what's the process now to get certainty on those questions?
I don't think anybody knows. So that's number one. We are in the process of a legal text being implemented in national regulation through different discussions. Basically, the European law involves limited liability companies. So in the case of Germany, Austria, or in Germany, it's the GmbH. The GmbH falls under ECSPR. And the law that was passed in Germany, Schwarenfinanzierungsbegleitgesetz, admits that. So, ECSPR is fully applicable also to the Vermögensanlagegesetz in Germany. Now, that is meaning that a crowdfunding platform under ECSPR can finance GmbHs with the financial structures that are allowed under ECSPR, so trading of shares, direct investment. Here the question is, would the notary requirement to do this transaction actually exclude this type of transaction? Under the legal text in ECSPR, no, there is a statement to this. But of course, the German government could argue differently and find a way around it. So this is a national discussion that needs to happen. If, for whatever reason, one member state does this, excludes the possibility, and the Commission doesn't believe that this is correct, they could ask the member state to clarify this. But I think this is a long water down the river before we get to that point. So here it is really important to work on national level to create this clarification. But in general, it is possible, and the notary requirement is not sufficient to exclude a GmbH. What the law also says, at least in our understanding, is that the member state doesn't have a choice to say to ESMA, oh, and this works and this doesn't work. They are legally obliged to inform about every possibility that exists according to the law. So if they want to exclude something, let's say they don't want to keep the limited liability company under ECSPR, but the notary requirement may not be sufficient, they would have to change their national law in order to make the transfer of the securities impossible. Otherwise, they should actually submit this to ESMA. Then the next question is what kind of transactions can we do? Can we do qualified subordinated loans and so on? And there the legal text also gives some guidance, so direct investments and also loans. And then there's a question about being repayable, ultimately repayable. And so this will be, again, a legal discussion on national level. What does this actually mean within the national context? Here, potentially, there could be some clarification from ESMA, but ESMA will not be able to direct member states. So this is right now our understanding, and the discussion here should be led on a national level with national regulators in order to create a positive implementation of this law in each member state.
If I can just add one sort of historical point here, one of the very, very last changes that was made to the regulation, just at the very last moment before it was approved, was around how admitted instruments were defined. Initially, when they came up with the concept, the idea was that each member state would be able to create a list of what securities qualified, and it was completely up to them. If Germany wanted to leave the GmbH off, you leave the GmbH off, and then at the very last moment, it was set up so that anyone that met a certain definition would automatically qualify, as Oliver said. I don't know where that change came from. I have a feeling that it was countries like Germany that didn't want to explicitly say that they weren't on the list, but then wanted to find ways to block them. But and certainly it creates some uncertainty. But in the end, I think Oliver's interpretation is right. If ESMA does its job, ESMA's going to say, look, these securities can be transferred, so you have absolutely no right to say they don't count unless you make them incapable of transfer, which would have all sorts of other implications. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, Jeff, there's the question with regard to the SPV structures. I think there's in general, and you are one who's worked a lot with SPVs, and I think the Germans also like the SPVs. And in some other markets as well. There was a lot of discussions on SPVs. And so there is something in the legal text, and ESMA already has clarified with a Q&A their interpretation of this. This is basically guidance for member states when they implement ECSPR. That's where they look for what they should do with SPVs. How is this going on? And you already mentioned earlier this might be difficult or not. I remember there was a key discussion on actually not allowing SPVs at all, and we argued a lot and came up with a solution at some point where SPVs would be allowed, but platforms wouldn't manage them. How do you see the current text describing this?
Yeah, so I mean, the background on this point, which was interesting and very reasonable, was that I think the Commission and everybody else involved in drafting was really keen that this regulation not be used as a sort of backdoor to creating fund structure. So although they're on the loan side, it's the idea of sort of portfolio management loans or management loan portfolio was specially carved out. But on the equity and security side, the view was that they really wanted this to be a regulation that allowed investors to pick a particular business to invest in and just invest in that business rather than picking some sort of a pool. And you can argue the merits of that or not. I think there are interesting arguments on both sides. Certainly at Seedrs, alongside our many direct investments, we've done some fund and pooled investments that prove very popular, and one would say have certain advantages even to them. But this was the intention, and certainly it's understandable. But then there's also a recognition that having an intermediating vehicle can be very useful, because if you have hundreds and hundreds of individual shareholders or bondholders, and suddenly you need a notary anytime anything's going to happen, or there needs to be significant involvement from each legal and registered shareholder or bondholder, that will become a potential nightmare. So this structure was agreed where you'd have SPV. You could put in place an SPV, but the SPV can only take access to one illiquid or indivisible asset. And the ECN the ESMA, has shared a little bit of interpretive guidance on that. And it's essentially, I think it's essentially fairly plain reading. It just says that this essentially means that you can have one thing in there, whether that's that's the shares of one company or one other asset, but it's got to be either illiquid or indivisible. And I think you interpret it fairly clearly from there. So I think it is clear the platforms are going to be able to use SPVs, one SPV per investee company, and the investors will be holders, shareholders, or whatever in the SPV, and the SPV will own the shares of the company. That bit, I think, is relatively clear, although I'm certainly open to anyone's views if it's not. Where I think it gets complicated is, Oliver, as you say, around the management of the SPVs. There's no explicit prohibition on the platform managing the SPV, but there is a rule that exercise of custodian rights or the exercise of custodian powers requires a separate license. And the regulated activities, the MiFID activities that are kind of carved out in the ECSP, are really about the fundraising, the financing activities, rather than about the administration activities. So I think there's going to be a very interesting question as to how you manage it. Do you outsource the management? Do you get the additional license, et cetera? And that's probably where, at least in my view, the uncertainty lies, and probably this is probably an area where different member states will interpret it differently.
If I remember right, there's a clear provision within the legal text that excludes any involvement of the platform in the transaction or the target company, and the SPV would act in a complete see-through way on behalf of the target company. So you could potentially argue, and that was at least at some point in the discussions, the reasoning behind some of these things, that the platform cannot be involved directly.
Well, certainly, and this is an area where the text and what we were getting told by the Commission didn't always line up, because certainly one of the things the Commission was saying was that the point here was to ensure that the platform didn't have any discretion over what investment invest in. You couldn't use SPVs like a SPAC, right? Like you couldn't just raise money for an SPV and then the platform, the SPV, go off and pick a company to invest in. The idea had to be clear that it was the investors knew what company the SPV was investing in and chose that. But then there were all sorts of questions around, well, what if the platform conducts due diligence and decides to reject the investment after the investors committed? Are they allowed to do that? And I think there is some uncertainty on those details.
Cool. Lisa, Christine, is there anything else that you see within your markets or with your business models that kind of reflect around the use of SPVs? You also run a venture capital fund, Lisa, on the side, so you might have some interactions there. Is there anything you want to add? Otherwise, I would also like the participants, of course, to maybe join the discussion and it becomes more lively and we have questions here.
No, one thing, because we get sometimes the request to use an SPV, and then indeed that such SPV raise money from the crowd, and then afterwards invest in various companies. So when the crowd invests in such SPV, they don't know in which kind of companies they will invest. But this is regulated under Dutch law or just within Europe, because then you also need to have a license as an investment firm. So I think in that way it will also be restricted to use an SPV and don't know in what kind of company you will invest in the future. But we often receive such requests in the market to have sort of a fund funded by the crowd.
Are there any? Oh, Christin.
Just to add to the SPV discussion, I mean, it's interesting that they decided this, because when you see the alignment of interest between platform and investors, because we used to have an SPV model as well before it was not allowed anymore, where we had it through our own SPVs in a way, which we supplied. And actually there in a way can be more safe, because the platform is responsible, but they interpret it in a way that it is safer to have it at the issuing company, because if I understand correctly, and please Jeff, if it's different, let me know. It would be possible for a target company to set up an SPV with the same MD as the target company and to use this SPV on the platform, right?
Yes, I think so. It's unclear to, I mean, it's unclear to me who has to, who would be allowed to set it up. But I don't think it's, whether it's the platform or the target company or somebody else, I don't think it's spelled out in legislation. But so long as, the key point is, so long as that is, all that SPV does is hold shares in the target company, then the goal of the regulation is for that to work.
Because what I would like to just add to the discussion as a criticism on how maybe legislators are approaching these things is that they believe that the conflicts of interest are such an issue that they prevent a more smooth and aligned process. I mean, as we know in capital markets, conflicts of interest are always okay as long as you disclose it. And I feel sometimes that the practitioner perspective on what really makes sense and is, because we as a platform, we want to take the accountability in some things, right? For us, it's, for example, safer to know we are in charge of the SPV, so we have also certain control over it, than to find a workaround, which is usually then the consequence, because people are doing it anyway. So I'm not sure if this now helps. I mean, it's something for the discussion of the evaluation of everything, but
there was a lot of misunderstanding about conflicts of interest in the process. I think a lot of lawmakers started with the presumption that any involvement by the platform, other than being a mere conduit, was somehow going to create conflicts of interest. And I think we had some success in persuading them that no, actually, you want the platform to be involved in various ways, and doing so often will align interests rather than create conflicts. But that was a long and hard discussion and not completely settled.
Thanks.
I think the same discussion was around specifically lending platforms co-investing or using institutional investors on the platform. That we have for the SPVs and so on. And so the solution there is that they can operate a fully licensed investment fund that can invest on the platform, but under discretionary terms. So they cannot do deal picking. They have to invest under exactly the same terms than any other investor would do, and it needs to be made visible to private investors as well. So I think here clearly, and maybe also not quite wrongly, the industry just needs to grow up a little bit before there is more trust and more opportunities are being created. I would argue that is something we should also be quite realistic about. When we started early on saying where the history of the regulation comes from, then this is de facto lightning speed for regulation in Brussels. 10 years after an industry has appeared, you have a law that even overrides some national prescriptions. That is not usually done. And this is something where the Commission in particular has taken great length in being proactive and innovative and driving this. which they're now using to replicate also dealing with other new innovative services. I look at crypto assets and so on. So I think this is something where we've been a test rabbit, a test case to see how it works. And so maybe not everything is perfect, but I think we have something here that is absolutely workable for a large number of platforms. I don't know if the audience can actually use the chat, but I think you can potentially wave a hand if you want to say something. And then we could have a discussion. Or if you can't wave a hand or do anything else, then maybe just write it into the Q&A so we can open your microphone.
Yeah, because it would be interesting also if anyone in the audience maybe has communication with the regulator and sees there any favorable regulation in their own countries. As Patrick was asking the question before, which country could be maybe interesting?
Yeah, I think here, what happens is in every member state, there needs to be a law like that has been in past in Germany that accompanies ECSPR into existing national law, because it's a European law that will have to be applied by the end of this year, or in some cases next year. But then the actually individual aspects that we may discuss about the use of marketing or the use of thresholds within the company, or the application process to the national authorities for a license, and how the details for every key information or investor information sheet are being submitted to the national regulator. This will be done after ESMA has submitted their views. And they still have some other regulatory technical standards to write and to publish. So there's a period where there will be some uncertainty. I think here it would be interesting to see indeed if people in other member states have some experience. We know that Hungary is also not very proactive. We know that the Austrians are aiming to secure their own market against ECSPR. If this is successful, we don't know. If this is worthwhile, it's a different discussion. Christine, Carsten also asked you a question about the issue of investor exploration.
Do you want to answer it? I mean, there's a question about maybe we can also distinguish between the test and the investor exploration. Are there differences, and how defined are they yet? I mean, as far as we understood, we need to ask for what's their salary or how much money do they have in order to see if it's a risk they can take, including the positions they have at the moment, their experience with different instruments. This is something we in the German crowdfunding law, for example, already had implemented in some way. So there is some uncertainty around how detailed it has to be. And I think we have a different understandings because, don't know, Carsten, if you want to join us for a moment to explain your perspective, to make it clearer, because what we understood so far is that it's actually quite straightforward in the questions which are asked. The only thing I would like to see is that investors can decide if they have to fill it out or not. And if they don't fill it out, it would mean that we don't have enough information to make a recommendation or not.
So Carsten, I don't know, try and say something. I allowed you to speak.
No, sorry, I have a level of IT issues here. The main issue is this. The level 1 text on investor exploration is really straightforward, and it's very simple, and I think it's a good compromise because it simply says the platform, the CSP, has to identify the level of knowledge which the investor has with the financial instrument, and how many assets he or she has available. However, if you look at the level 2 text, which was provided by ESMA, it's much more than that, and I don't think I personally don't think it's covered by level 1. You know, for instance, it's asked academic degrees, professional experience, and these kind of things. And last Thursday we had a call in the Altfinator network, and we discussed this. And investor exploration is really a conversion breaker. If people go to a platform for the very first time and then they suddenly have to fill out 25 or 30 questions, this might really, get people not to sign up to these platforms. So our statement to ESMA will be to stick to the original text of the ECSP regulation and only use those criteria, don't go beyond this. And what we also heard was that this is partially because some member states are using this ESMA consultation process or the level 2 drafting to increase the stringency for platforms, make it more difficult for platforms to onboard investors. And so that's why we want to actually strengthen the position of the European Commission by saying, look, the level 1 text, the ECSPR, was already a really good compromise and was already quite good when it came to investor exploration. But that's really a concern for me, that this is going too far and becomes really burdensome and will make it especially difficult for smaller platforms to onboard new investors. Of course, the big platforms who have already large amount of investors, for them it might not be that challenging then.
Carsten, do you have an idea of how much more this is really? I mean, is it? Can you put a cost to it or a time, or is this just more feeling? I mean, it was always good to have an understanding there.
No, I think it's quite a lot. I mean, to be honest, it's the original level 1 text, as I said, has only 2 things which were requested. And if you look at the clarification which was done by ESMA, this is much more than that. It wants much more. And Christine and we talked about this earlier. The platform has to keep all this data. They have to store it safely. They have to make sure the data protection is in. And even if people are not required to fill it out, then they might still, you have to save it and so on. But I think we just have to make sure that we as industry, we say, we don't want the investors to be really, having to open up everything to us as platforms. We want the investors to only tell us, do they know what the financial instruments are, what kind of risks are associated with this, and then also do they understand what kind of losses they can have with their investments. And beyond that, I think the investors are not children. They know what they are doing. And we don't need to go so much deeper into their professional and personal life to really assess what we're doing. The platforms are only intermediating. We are not doing investment consultancy for the investors. So the investors in the end have the final choice whether to invest or not.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Carsten. Jeff, Lisa, do you have any issue with that, or kind of?
I'm going to revisit the exact text. My interpretation was, or my initial read of that. I mean, this is a critical point, and it's absolutely true that if you ask for too much or too much verification from investors, that becomes a real limiter. I didn't on first read think that this was, seemed overly burdensome. But Carsten, given your comments, I will certainly take another look, and perhaps this is something that we need to feed into our response if it really is as challenging as you say.
I mean, the point that Carsten made is, of course, clear. ESMA is working on behalf of member states, and we cannot exclude at least the attempt by some member states to strengthen some of their views through the work of ESMA. So that is clear. Are there any other questions from the audience? Did I see another raised hand earlier on? No, everyone is super happy otherwise with the legal text and the future of the industry. Cool.
I mean, there are people mentioning that they are also working on DLT platforms. It's actually an interesting topic maybe to address regarding security tokens. This was also a big topic we had discussed, because many of us see security tokens included in the instruments, but based on the crypto asset regulation, which are set up at the moment, it's not so clear. Do you guys have a clearer understanding about how token offerings are included in ECSP or not?
So from our understanding and our views is we have, of course, MiCA, Markets and Crypto Assets regulation proposal that does not deal with token offerings as such. So this wouldn't necessarily be applicable to security tokens that could, in theory, fall under ECSPR. So if we take this, then there is the question, and we had this discussion also with ESMA, if crypto assets are seen as securities in a member state, like in Germany, in theory, then crypto assets could be falling under ECSPR. So there could be security tokens issued under ECSPR if they are treated as a security under securities law. I think there is no one approach in the member states. So that is still outlined. And so I think here is the question where we would urge ESMA, of course, to consider this and allow security tokens as long as they fall under security laws. And then they would be applicable in ESMA as well, in ECSPR as well. So this would be our recommendation, but I think there is no clarity within the member states about this yet. Okay. But maybe since we talked about MiCA, I mean, this is it's a different thing, and it will for sure encourage a lot of other things that may also, on one or other level, create some competition. There is also being discussed right now the regulation for consumer loans, so the typical peer-to-peer platforms. That is to be published still, so we haven't seen it yet. But it would fall in all likelihood under the Consumer Credit Directive. So this is a different discussion. This is a different market. Here we only talk about financial services for businesses, so SMEs. So this is what ECSPR is about, and I think which also is the main driver for the activities that we've done in the past. So there's another question here from Patrick. Patrick, do you want to maybe say that and then join the discussion for this? I just put you online.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, hi, just a quick one. We are using distributed ledger technology, so DLT on our platform, and we are registering the investment opportunities as non-tradable tokens at the moment, because we've had large discussions with the Dutch National Bank and the AFM about what you could and could not do. And the biggest problem with security tokens is if you create them on a smart chain, Binance Smart Chain, for example, or any other type of decentralized exchange, you can automatically trade them. You fall foul of all kinds of AML and AML laws. Let's start there. But yeah, it may be easy to say that we can have security tokens under the European crowdfunding regulation, but we do not see this happening at all, because you really just cannot check where the money is coming from. So we just use it for transparency purposes only. That's the only thing I wanted to comment. There is really not much else to say about it. The regulation is just really not there yet. And it's not necessarily so. The technology is there. There's lots of providers that will allow you to create a security token that you control in a centralized manner. But what you cannot control is where the money is coming from. Because there's nobody that will take the responsibility to see where, if somebody bought a cryptocurrency in 2017, for argument's sake, before the hype, and it is now worth 10,000 times more, how do you get a source of funds? Those are the kinds of questions that we were trying to address, and we just couldn't. I was just sharing with info.
Okay, thank you very much. So if I understand it right, even though you could in theory do it, you fear that other routes will prohibit it, and quite rightly, I think the regulation here would expect to ask you to do AML and see where the money comes from. So it might be a technical issue or a practical issue. There's now more questions on tokens.
Christina raised her hand, Oliver.
Who?
Can it be?
Christina. Oh, always. Christina? Oh, she didn't want to say anything.
What's the test?
Ask to unmute.
But okay, what else were issues recently which maybe are a good opportunity to talk about? Jeff, do you see, or Lisa, any specific issues otherwise, which maybe it's good to get input for 28th? Carsten raised his hand also again, right?
We have a comment from Johannes on the recital 15 states that tokens are materially different from crowdfunding services. But here the tokens were referred to ICOs. It's a long time ago. There was a discussion in the parliament at the time and a push by the parliament to include initial coin offerings into ECSPR. And that was voted out very quickly. And I think the recital states that ICOs, so coin offerings, should not be part of ECSPR, and so they are not. That's where Mika would probably more come in, if at all. But security tokens would still be something slightly different. But yes, even if they can be subsumed and under transferable securities. Don't know, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly right. I think this is one of those areas that just wound up unclear because of the way it evolved. Exactly as you say, there was this whole move around ICOs starting in 2018, and at the time, frankly, I think a lot of the people who were pushing it really didn't, weren't thinking in terms of the difference between utility tokens and security tokens, and weren't really thinking tokens as a form of transferable security. They wanted to see if they could extend the legislation much broader to all forms of tokens. That was shot down. So you get language like what's in the recital saying, no, we're not doing this, but nobody really ever addressed the fact that there is this whole world of crossover between transferable securities and tokens. I think it would be very difficult, not that regulators won't try, but I think it would be very difficult to keep genuine security tokens out of this. I mean, I think that if a token meets the requirements of a transferable security or admitted instrument for that matter, I don't think there's a legislative basis to say that you can't use it. That doesn't mean people won't attempt to, but that's my interpretation.
Cool. Okay, so we still have 10 minutes left. Question from Carsten. I don't know if you can say something, Carsten.
Yeah, but I don't want to jump ahead of anyone. If
Go ahead.
Okay. So regarding marketing and communication, I mean, there's two sides to it, right? There's Article 27, which talks about the marketing related to the issuer, the project owner. And then there's also marketing and communications done by the platform, which is regulated in Article 12. And in Article 12, in the level 1 text, it's mostly about that the platform says when they are licensing in which member states they want to be active. So let's say Seedrs wants to, gets the Dutch license or the Dutch ECSP license. Then by doing so, Jeff would have to say, Seedrs is not only going to be active in the Netherlands, but it's also going to be active in Germany, France, Ireland. So they would. So the platform has to state, what their intentions are. But if you look at the level 2 text here again, this is getting very specific, and I think ESMA is trying to clarify this, but it's getting to a point in my view where it's getting too, they have to, the platform has to explain the frequency of marketing communication. And how often they want to do funding rounds in that specific member state. And I think already during the open consultation, we raised this issue with ESMA, and I think they were really understanding and saying, this is not so much plannable. I don't know, maybe Jeff knows what Seedrs is going to do in 5 years, but many platforms probably don't know where they're going to be active in 2 or 3 years, but they have to clarify this for the next 3 years. So our argumentation to ESMA was, let's make it really easy for the CSPs. In the licensing, they should simply say, we are going to be active in this member state XYZ, and we are going to use the following languages. And that's it, not go into more detail. But this is, I think, something, again, where the level 2 text goes way beyond what was originally in the level 1 text. So I think we will flag it, and I hope other platforms and associations and the ECN can also raise this issue, because otherwise the licensing application is going to be 500 pages for each platform. That's probably not going to be too good for everyone.
Thank you, Carsten. I think if it is 500 pages, then we can be sure that the national regulators will change the rules very quickly. So we shouldn't forget that they also have to deal with this, and that has to be manageable. On the other hand, I assume, maybe Lisa, Christine, and Jeff can ask it as well. How many countries you want to operate in the next 2 years. The plan you're doing now, and not next year.
I think, look, the way I would probably look at this is twofold. One is, just like under MiFID, where you indicate what countries you want a passport to, you just tick them all. There's generally no harm in at least notifying that you're going to do everywhere, even if you aren't actually. And then I think in terms of then giving specific estimates of your levels of business in each country, I agree it's a nuisance, but look, I certainly remember when we first got regulated in the UK, there were all sorts of questions about how much business are you going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, and you give them estimates and you update the estimates as needed, as time goes forward. But so long as there's no liability for getting it wrong, or there's no cap that says, okay, you say you're going to do X, you can't do any more than X, I don't see this as all that big a deal. I think it's probably a little bit of extra work. But I think my guess is that ESMA included this more than anything just to help it measure and track what activity they're likely to see in different parts of Europe. But this one doesn't concern me a huge amount.
Lisa, Christine, anything from your end to this?
No, I agree with Jeff. We didn't see this as a big hurdle either in the application process.
So maybe it has to do with when you look at the text, everybody sees a little bit different, and maybe everybody plans a little bit different as well. I think this is something that potentially the lawmakers in Brussels and now ESMA cannot foresee as well. So and let's not forget, we may talk about 100 platforms that may consider applying for ECSPR out of at maximum 27 member states. You need to find a middle ground that is workable for everyone. So yeah, okay. I think it can be a concern, and maybe it's worth looking at it, but maybe it's not everything is a concern. Are there any other questions from the audience at this time?
Oliver, in the meanwhile, while people maybe think about the question, is there anything, because what Carsten just described was also showing a little bit how different angles you can take on each of the potential issues. And we from ECN, based also on your long years of experience in direct communication, bring ECSP about also maybe have a feeling about what's really an issue and what's not an issue, based on what Jeff just said, that it's also sometimes a line of interpretation, and it's actually just information they need, which doesn't have risk consequences in handing them in, right? So maybe you can explain a little bit our approach here, what also regarding also the consultation and how we argue things, that we are more focusing on very big issues and things where we see, okay, this is actually, you know, not the biggest issue, we just leave out? Or maybe you can explain a little bit the strategy here.
You're assuming that there's a strategy. Look, I think over the past years and also now we are trying to be pragmatic. So there is, at this point, we have a legal text. We've got there, however we got there, nobody knows, but it's there. And now we have to deal with the work of ESMA, which is very proactive and open and happy to discuss and exchange, and maybe even, you know, sometimes trying to see if there's something they could do for the industry. But realistically, we have an intention behind the law. We have a political meaning behind the law that is not lost within the member states. It has been written by the member states. It has been signed off by the member states. And so I think there is some fights that are worthwhile fighting, and admitted instruments is for sure one of these things that must be clarified. And then there is potentially some other issues that are not really that important, because even though there might be an issue in the implementation at the first time, in the end, that's just how it is. I mean, if you're concerned that your investors have to provide information about their background in academia, then that is what I have to submit when I subscribe to a newspaper as well. So, you know, there's some levels that might be just acceptable, where the industry just needs to take this step and understand that this is now a European law that expects a European professional industry to develop from this, that can hold its own and compete with other sectors like venture capital, that can provide significant funds to the economy by providing, you know, small investors with, you know, adequate protection. And I think if we look at this, then I think a lot of these smaller things that initially looked like, ooh, they ask too many things and this is cumbersome for us as a platform, what is if something changes? Then you need to go the pragmatic way, as Jeff put it, and say, you just apply for all of them initially, and there's no penalty if you don't suddenly, you know, become active in all of these markets. And you find a way of asking the whole information. And yes, it is a bit harder, but yes, you can operate in a market that is, I don't know how many people we are now without the UK, 400 and something million people. So it's a big market, it's a big opportunity, and it requires, I think, a new sense of professionalism. And I think this is when we started with this with Jeff, this is where I think this harmonized way that we are now having to deal with is potentially an issue for many of the smaller platforms that maybe have no issue with becoming a big player, but never had the intention to do this right now. But now they are forced with this. And I think this is something where potentially member states can also, you know, see if there isn't a way of supporting them. But that is, I think, out of our scope to now try to force to level 2 and then maybe level 3, something that makes it perfect for everyone. This is not going to happen, and it was never the intention of the policymakers. So, and with that understanding, I think we just need to take some things as a given. My view. I don't know if somebody else has a different view, Jeff or Elisa, or you, Christine.
Maybe then to be added, Oliver, regarding the novellation or re-evaluation in 2 years of the ECSP, there would be the chance to track as platforms, for example, to say, okay, I have a conversion rate break because of the investor exploration of, let's say, 70%. And then these are data we as an industry can collect in order to maybe open certain points again, right? Maybe you could share also about the further.
So the Commission is, of course, experienced by now in these processes, and we are not the ones that suffer from this. So they know that after the process we've gone through, 2 years of negotiations in Brussels, 2.5 years, and then another year, you know, level 2 with ESMA, and then implementation on the member state. That as of 22, you can probably chase every policymaker who's been involved in this process down the hallway by mentioning crowdfunding. Just leave me alone with crowdfunding. I've done it, 4 years of my life. There's other things that are more important, and I have very little time. And so very, very smartly, of course, this revision is written into the legal text. It must be revised. And this is why there's data provisions, and this is why there's data collection by platforms, and then the key information sheets being sent to the authorities, and then also some data passed on to ESMA so that they can measure the impact. And there will be, for sure, over the next few years, outreach to the market to see what works, what doesn't work, how can we improve things, but also, of course, how can we make things stricter where there have been bad actors. We had bad actors in the industry before. We will have them under ECSPR. It's been written to avoid, but for sure it will happen at some point. And this is what this revision will bring. And so this is the most exciting part, is starting with the implementation of ECSPR, because that is the test for 2 years of what works, what doesn't work, and then the industry can work with the policymakers to adjust and make it even better. But for that, of course, there needs to be also the engagement from the sector. So this is how I see these implementation phase, and we look at it exactly this way. This will be a lot of work, and it will be very exciting.
Are you reading it, Oliver, what Francesca was mentioning? Or?
Yes, so we have a question from YouTube. Thank you, YouTube. What advice would you give to regulators and platforms in countries such as Spain or Italy to take into account ECSP adjustments? Well, so it obviously depends always on your national settings. For the Italian market, the local regulation for security crowdfunding has been quite tight. And so I understand that platforms that have been regulated in Italy will find it quite easy to adjust to ECSPR. And they will not have very high compliance costs either, because they already deliver much of this. For lending platforms, there wasn't any regulation. That will be much harder. So I think there you will need some guidance for the lending market, clearly. Then in Spain, it's similar. There is existing regulation. What can you say? The law will be implemented as it is in the member state, and the things that are being discussed in level 2 now fall under the scope where the member states then have some scope to make changes. So I don't know if you need to advise them anything, but I would argue for regulators, it's the same as for platforms. This is a great opportunity. I mean, make it work for your country, create jobs, create investments. Let's put it blank. If the Germans are stupid to prohibit it, then make sure the German investors invest in your country. Let's make sure the German companies go to Spain and raise funds there. That is, I think, very clearly the message that also is behind this regulation. And in 2 years, this is where the changes will come. The markets that haven't performed but maybe want to really take a piece of the pie, they will adjust the regulation, and they will adjust the way they implemented it. I mean, that is the result we all should work for. Cool. So basically, we've used our 1.5 hours. Any last words from you, Lisa, Christine, Jeff? No, everything has been said. Cool.
I guess my, I always like to convey a little bit of optimism around this. I think there are a lot of complex issues that, are going to need to get solved over the next few years. And I think, those of us who are going to be in the weeds trying to do so will have our share of headaches. But fundamentally, I really do think that this is going to open up crowdfunding across Europe. I think this is going to be a great opportunity for companies, for investors, and for platforms. And so, it's easy to get lost in the weeds a little bit, but I think we should all be excited about what this holds in store.
I would agree.
Great. Thank you very much. thank you.
Also, Oliver, activate everybody to join ECN who is not a member yet, right? And we have on the 16th of June a great event coming up, and check out
17th.
the newsletter and the new website and everything. I mean, it's much to come in the future.
Yes, so times are changing. That's what we thought as well. We have grown. Of course, everybody should join us, especially now where crowdfunding will become European. But then it's understandable that not everybody can or want or does have the time. But I think if you wanted to have participated in this, you should have been there 2 years ago. Those who haven't now need to kind of adjust, but I think it's fine for everyone. We are open, and we are going to focus on this and a few new other activities, of course. And after now nearly 10 years, it's next year that we are in the market for 10 years. Safe, sustainable to some degree. We are quite happy that we could go this path with some of you. Yeah. So thank you very much. And then I see you all around, and please check out our website, register to the newsletter. We will have more CrowdTuesdays, and for sure we will talk about ECSPR more and not only once. Thank you. Bye-bye.